Hello everyone, this is Brian from Chess Fanatic, here with another chess video. Today, I'm going to be going over a very interesting and aggressive way to combat the Modern Benoni as white. Now the Modern Benoni, which I will be going over shortly, has become quite popular recently, and can be tough to get an edge as white if black plays correctly. First, let me go over some general Benoni theory and ideas before getting into the two sidelines that I'm going to go over. To understand how to play this opening as white, you must first understand the goals of white and black in Modern Benoni theory. So the Modern Benoni starts after d4. Now in one of my past videos on the Queen's Gambit, I went over the move d4 and compared it to e4, if you're wondering which one to play. So if you're interested, you can go see that. But after d4, knight f6, c4, and c5, we have d5. Now I'm not going to go over this very much, but something like d takes c5 would not be very good, as black would simply go e6. This pawn is eventually going to fall and is hard to protect, and white has given up the center. And a move like knight f3 or e3 will simply avoid Benoni positions altogether. So that's an option if you want to do that, but I think you get the most advantage when you play d5. Now we have e6, knight c3, e takes d5, c takes d5, and d6. Now this is extremely common in a Modern Benoni position, and this is going to be the type of position that I'm going to focus on for these sidelines. Notice how black has blocked the white pawn on d5. This is one of the main ideas. Although the pawns are pushed and look good, you're eventually going to get e4 in. That's a common idea for d4 openings. Even though you have that, black still has counterplay and is going to get stuff like knight b to d7, possibly to e5. Another common idea is or almost always you're going to fianchetto your bishop on g7, and you're going to have this extremely strong bishop. Just notice how there's no white pawns on any of these dark squares, so you're going to have this extremely strong bishop coming down this a1, h8 diagonal, and you're going to have this bad bishop on c8, this light-squared bishop. Black is constantly trying to get rid of this light-squared bishop by trading it off. Usually that's done by putting it on g4, in which there is usually a knight, and after e4 has been played, this knight will be pinned, and black will have successfully traded down the light-squared bishop, which he wants to do. The final most important idea of the Modern Benoni, maybe not most important, but an important idea, is a6 and b5. Black constantly wants to achieve this. He constantly goes a6, and almost always white will respond with a4 to stop this b5. If he lets b5 happen, black gains a lot of space, and this is relatively equal, but white has given away the starting advantage. Okay, so let's get into some of the sidelines. So we have knight f3, g6. Simply fianchettoing this bishop, but now an interesting move from white, queen a4 check. The idea of this move is to put a piece of black's on d7, weakening this d6 square. Whether it be a knight to d7 or a bishop to d7, this d6 pawn is going to be weaker because the queen is no longer protecting it. Also, eventually, once this bishop comes to g8, if it will, there will be no protection of this d6 pawn, and a move like bishop f4 can be problematic for black. So let's get into the responses that black may have. First of all, some bad responses include knight f to d7. This simply blocks up black's position, and this knight is pinned, and it's blocking this knight and this bishop from developing. This is simply better for white. Then we have, queen to d7. This is a bad move, but has been played in some high-level games, which is pretty surprising, actually, in which you can just go queen to h4. After queen h4, white simply has an advantage. After something like bishop g7, bishop h6, castle, and trading the bishops, this queen simply blocks the development of the light-squared bishop and the development of the knight. This is better for white. Now for some of the good moves. One good move in response to queen a4 check is knight b to d7. Knight b to d7 has the idea of eventually pushing a6 and b5. Because the queen is on a4, white will not be able to move a4, stopping b5, and so black will get this expansion. The problem with this is that it will usually take a few moves to get b5. For example, let's say something like bishop f4, a6, e4, and you cannot immediately push b5. If you do, there is bishop takes b5, and you cannot take back, or there is a rook hanging. So instead, after e4, black must go rook b8. Then after something like bishop d3, b5 does achieve this queenside expansion that black wants, which you must go queen c2, and this is still slightly better for white, but black has his counterplay. Another move is bishop to d7. Bishop to d7 is probably the most common move. I was kind of surprised by that. I would have expected knight b to d7 to be the most common, because you're constantly trying to put this knight on d7, so might as well put it there. But bishop d7 pushes the queen away, and as well as blocks the check. Now the most common square is b3. There's also queen to c2, but that's less common. Queen to b3 is common because it attacks this weak b7 square. Now you could have several moves, including queen b6, in which you can simply normally develop, and this will often occur in d4 openings, in which you have a queen on b6 and a queen on b3, sort of standing off, not trading off, because if you were to trade off, you would allow your opponent to have pressure down the a file. So that's one option after queen b3. Another one is queen to c7, probably the most common one, adding protection to this d6 square, as well as the b7 square that's being immediately attacked. After this, you can simply go something like bishop f4, bishop g7, e4, and this is going to be relatively equal, but notice how black has kept his bad bishop, which he doesn't really want to do. You're going to go knight to d2, knight to c4, and this is going to be a fine game for white. Another move that's common that you should watch out for is knight a6, as this pawn is not hanging. If you were to take this pawn, there is knight b4, and knight c2 is hard to stop, and this is looking good for black. Black definitely has compensation for the pawn and is probably going to win more material. So that's mainly all of the queen a4 check lines. I highly recommend you doing queen a4 check. Also, queen a4 check does not work if you go something like e4. You need this knight here. You cannot do it with e4. I highly recommend this line because many people will not be expecting this check, will not know how to respond to it, and it's also fun putting pressure on the d6 pawn, and they have to respond accurately. Black must respond accurately to defend this pawn. So now let's get on to the next line. So the next line happens after e4 instead of knight f3, although a different move order could go knight f3 as well. And after g6, you go knight f3, and now bishop g4 looks good, but is not possible yet. This is because after queen a4 check, you force either the bishop back or the knight here. If the knight goes here, you can go knight d2. Because this knight on d7 is pinned, this bishop is looking extremely awkward as it cannot retreat, and h3 and g4 is coming, and there's no real great way to stop this. the best way is probably just to sacrifice the knight in hopes of gaining an attack, but a knight for 2 pawns is not a good trade for black. If you move the bishop back, then this transposes into one of the lines I just showed you, except white has an extra move, so it's better for white. So, bishop g4 is not immediately possible. So people thought of doing a6 first. Now, as I said, a6 threatens b5, and almost always you go a4. So the idea for black with this move is after a4 to go bishop g4, and now there is no queen a4 check. Because of this, black has successfully created this pin on the knight with the light squared bishop and is going to trade off its bad light squared bishop. So what's a good way to combat this a6 idea? Because after black achieves this, black probably has equality in this position. Now the move is quite a surprising one, and I did not expect it when I saw it. It was queen e2. Queen e2, when I first saw this, looks like it just blocks the light squared bishop and puts the queen on sort of an awkward square. I could not believe that this was the reason why many people did not play a6 in this position. But the reason for this is that the queen is taking advantage of the fact that the black pieces are not developed. All these pieces are on the back rank. Only the knight is developed, while white has 2 knights. And you're also threatening e5, e4 to e5. Almost always you're going to go e4 to e5. I'll show you many different lines. Almost every single one of them you're going to make this push. If you don't, usually black just castles, and you have this awkward queen on e2. But first of all, let me go over some sort of bad lines. So one of the bad lines is bishop to e7. After bishop e7, you can simply go a4, and after castling, queen c2. Now, I did say before that if they achieve castling, your queen is just awkward, and you spend 2 moves moving your queen. However, this bishop is very awkward on e7. You're going to be able to get bishop h6 in. They don't have better development than you do, so it was fine making the queen move, the 2 queen moves, and you are just in a better position. Now, another move that is very bad in this position, definitely worse than bishop e7, is b5. Now, b5 looks like it'd be good for black. This is one of black's goals, to expand on the queen side. However, in this position, it is not a very good move, and that is because after e4, e5, d takes e5, and knight takes e5, there is not a great way to respond to the threats. For example, if you try and go queen e7, there's simply bishop f4. If something like knight h5, there's g3, and you're going to take advantage of the g2, a8 diagonal, and this light squared bishop is just extremely strong here. But usually knight d7 is played, in which similarly you'll go g3, and after bishop b7, bishop g2, queenside castle, knight takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop takes e5, bishop g7, and bishop h3 check. Just the bishops were too strong, and so white had a clear advantage from the beginning of this line, and is just crushing in this position. So for those reasons, b5 is not a viable move. There are 3 good moves. Queen e7 usually transposes into most of these lines, as I'll show you later. I'll go over that one last. But first, let me just go over the 3 main moves, and that includes bishop g4, knight b to d7, as well as even bishop g7. Now, bishop g4, the idea is to eliminate this knight, which is sort of an attacking piece in this position, so that when e5 is played, you can go bishop takes f3, g takes f3, d takes e5, queen takes e5 check, and queen e7. Now you can take this queen. I wouldn't recommend it, but most people go bishop f4, and this is a normal position. Queen takes e5 check. There's also knight b to d7, but this is actually considered worse because of queen takes queen, bishop takes e7, queenside castle, knight h5, and bishop c7. Now, one idea, or many ideas in these positions, whatever move they respond to the queen e2, is getting this bishop on f4 and keeping it on the h2 b8 diagonal. If you allow black to get this bishop to d6, you're usually worse and black will be fine. This is because this d pawn is extremely strong, and pushing it at the right time can be even stronger. So that's the normal position that you are going to get. And you want to think about pushing this pawn at the right time, queenside castling, as well as getting a strong light squared bishop on g2 eventually, after you open up this pawn and this pawn. Next we have knight b to d7. This move immediately kind of protects e5 and prepares for e5. So after e5, we have d takes e5, knight takes e5, and queen e7. Now you can go bishop f4 here, but I think best by test is knight takes d7, after which there's bishop takes d7. You also could do queen takes e2 check first, bishop f4, queenside castle, and this is going to be relatively equal. And just to notice how when you go queen e2, you are going to get these sort of strange positions with a d pawn that's unprotected. There's no e pawn or c pawn, but you are going to get attacking positions with nice bishops. The final move is bishop g7. Bishop g7 is interesting because it doesn't really immediately protect this push, because after queen takes e5, if queen e7, looks like you can just take and go into this endgame, after which you go bishop f4. I think this looks better for white, although in the database black has proved equality, or even being better in this position. So you can queenside castle, knight b to d7, a4, and this is relatively equal, but you have this d pawn that is ready to be pushed, as well as an open king. So back to queen e7, or queen takes e5 check. The best, well, maybe not the best move, but most played move is king f8, in which you can go bishop e2. Now bishop e2 is actually the best place for the bishop, which is surprising. Usually you'd want to put it to d3 or c4. C4 is obviously worse because there's b5 with tempo. So the bishop would have to move immediately back after b5, and something like b4 could come next. d3 is worse because you're simply blocking this d pawn. This d pawn is usually pretty weak, and you want a rook eventually behind it. You're going to go bishop f4 eventually, and queenside castle. You don't want this d3 bishop blocking the rook to the d5 pawn. For that reason, bishop e2 is probably the best place for the bishop that offers the best chance for advantage in this position. So that is the queen e2 variation. I think it's called the Epishim variation. I think it's a great variation if you love attacking. You are going to get slightly strange positions because the d-pawn is going to be hanging, which is a little bit strange on d5. But just when playing this, remember to keep that bishop on f4, as well as get a strong bishop on g2 to a8 diagonal. So please like and subscribe. I hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.